Journey of the Soul, lesson 1. There's a guy who was going out for his first date, and he made up with his friend that after a couple hours he should call him on his cell phone, and he'll excuse himself, and if things aren't going so well, it will be an excuse to have a moment away from his date. So he comes back to he goes out, and he's sitting and talking for a little while, and the phone starts to vibrate. He says, listen, I got to take a break for a moment. He steps away, and when he comes back, he sits down, puts his head down, and he says, I'm really sorry. Just wanted to let you know that I got to go. I just found out terrible news. My grandfather passed away. So the date, she says back to him, she says, thank God. He says, what do you mean? What do you mean, thank God? She says, well, if it wasn't your grandfather, it was going to be my grandfather. So death is something that we all deal with. We deal with it differently, but we all deal with. Some have fear because of death. Some simply embrace it, and some ignore it. And I'll get back to that in a moment. But tonight, of course, we've come to discuss what is the Jewish perspective of death and the afterlife. And the question is, why is it relevant? Why is it relevant what happens after we leave this world? Why is this subject in general relevant? And in order to appreciate that, I want you to take a moment to go to the chat box and share what was it about this course, or the title of this course, that made you join. What was your particular focus or interest in participating in this class? Someone writes, I always wondered how people close to death make peace with it, almost ease into it. It's a very interesting thought. Not sure what Jewish perspective is on death and can never seem to get a straight answer. Is there any straight answer from a Jewish perspective? They always say if there's if there are 2 Jews, 3 opinions. So, but we will absolutely get into that. Life after death, we're going to talk about it. Someone writes, Rabbi, we just need Mashiach already. Some people are just curious about what happens after death. Why is cremation against Jewish law? It's a good question. We will touch that at one point during the classes. One person writes, I just finished reading 7 Conversations with Jerry. The topic I need more. I need more clarity. Knowing that there are connections after death, just to learn more and share experiences. Okay, good. I'm going to close the chat box of this. People have lost loved ones. Very good point. There are people a lot of people are interested in this simply because they've lost loved ones, family members. We have people here who have lost a child or other family members, and so let's talk about the topics that we're going to cover in this course. But I want to just say that what we'll find out, and especially in tonight's lesson, that the course is really about life rather than death. Although we're going to cover everything that we consider death, all the ideas that we've spoken about. But I want to mention that there are generally there are generally three ways of dealing with death or thinking about death. So sometimes we think of death in philosophical terms. People want to know what the purpose is. There purpose in death? What happens to the soul? Is there heaven or hell? One question already was about reincarnation. So that's addressing the philosophical aspect of death. We also have the emotional issues. So one of our participants shared in the chat box that he lost a child, and there's a lot of emotions that come with that, and there could be loved ones that we have lost, and therefore we want to know, we're thinking about death. We also want to know how to deal, and that's one of the things that we're going to touch upon, how to deal with death and loss, how to recover from it. So that's from an emotional perspective. And then, of course, we want to see it from a practical perspective. There's a lot of things that are involved. Practically, if a person's thinking about their own mortality, then they're thinking about, how do I prepare for death? But then there is Jewish funeral and mourning, the significance of the Jewish customs that are related to death and mourning, how to remember a loved one, what should we or shouldn't we say to people who are grieving, and that's a very important part that we will discuss during this class. So again, we're going to discuss the philosophical, the emotional, and practical, and I think by doing that, we're going to address everyone, all our participants, all our friends who have joined us, all the students that have joined us for this class. Now, as I mentioned earlier, people deal with death differently. There are many people that whenever they encounter death, they feel fear as a result of encountering death. There are many people who embrace it, and there are many people who ignore it. Now, when it comes to life's challenges, there are many, many challenges that we go through in life, whether it's financial challenges, whether it's health challenges, or other challenges that we go through in life. Ultimately, there is nothing that compares to the challenge of death. And the reason for that is that death is final. Because every other challenge that we have, there is always a thought that we can get over it. There is a possibility to get over it. And I could deal with it, which means there's a time frame in my mind. You know, yes, I'm dealing with it now, but ultimately I'll get over it at some point. We'll find a cure, we'll find a solution, and I'll be able to get over it. But when it comes to death, death is final, and there's nothing else. Now, also something that is very important, and that is to consider, and that is many people actually feel very, very uncomfortable, which I would say is one of the reasons there are a number of our JLI students who aren't participating in this class simply because they're uncomfortable with the concept of death, and they don't want to deal with it, they don't want to confront it, they don't want to explore it. So there are ideas in related to afterlife and death and so on, which causes such fear and anxiety that many people just shut off and don't want to discuss it. That actually comes from a tremendous gift that God gave us, and that is the gift of self-awareness. Now, the gift of self-awareness is something tremendous, but at the same time, that gift of self-awareness creates anxiety because I don't know what is going to happen when I die. When will that be? Is my life over? And questions, and everybody has questions in different ways. I want everybody to take a moment to read to yourselves text number 1. I hope you were able to click on the link where you have the PDF, the text, just to take a moment. If you don't, it's fine. But just to see how there is this fear that everybody has ultimately, which I want to talk about in a moment. Okay. The truth is that everyone fears death. The only question is how we manage it. We all manage it differently. And why is this important? It's important because our fear of death, even if we manage it properly, if we feel we manage it properly, actually affects the way we behave. It affects our life. And so it's an important topic. In fact, because it affects us so greatly, that is the reason why terrorists, for example, do what they do. When they terrorize, their goal is not only, a very small part of their goal is actually killing people. Their ultimate goal is to create fear, because when we see people around us or someone we know or we hear about death, what that does is that creates a tremendous fear and anxiety within us. Now, again, we all deal with it differently, but ultimately that is their goal. September 11th, that was the ultimate goal, to create fear in the United States. So with that introduction, I want to just say that while we are talking so much about death, the course is actually about life. Because in order to appreciate what death is, so that we can calm our anxieties and appreciate what it is and understand it and learn how to overcome it, learn how to deal with loss and so on. In order to do that, we have to understand what life really is. And that's the first thing that we're going to do tonight. We are going to learn about what the real me is, who am I, what is life. That's our step number 1. Who is the real me? Step number 2, we are going to talk about the value of this world. And then there'll be a couple of other things that we will go into, smaller points that will help us appreciate what life really is. And again, to be able to calm our anxieties and our fears and answer many of our questions. So who am I? It's a famous story of a guy in the famous town of Chelm. Some of you may have heard of Chelm. Chelm was actually a town of very wise people in Europe. However, they, if you wanted to tell a joke, he told a joke about the Chelmites. So there was a guy in Chelm who had an identity crisis. See, he was always worried about who he is and losing his identity. So he tied a red string around his toe so that he should always know who he is. And he goes into the bathhouse. He goes into the water, and with the water, the string came off, and it got tangled in someone else's toe. So he sees this other guy with the red string tied to his toe, and he looks and he says, I know who you are, but can you tell me who I am? So who are we? There's a famous story about the first Chabad Rebbe and his grandson, the Tzemach Tzedek, who later became the third Rebbe, whose name was Menachem Mendel. And the Alter Rebbe, the first Rebbe, is sitting with his grandson on his lap, and the grandson starts to stroke his father's beard and say, Zayda, Zayda, grandfather, grandfather. So his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, he looks at him and he says, this is not grandfather. He's stroking my beard. That's not grandfather. That's grandfather's beard. So he points to grandfather's head. He says, no, that's grandfather's head. That's not grandfather. And they're going through grandfather's hands, grandfather's feet, grandfather's this, that, whatever it is. So at the end, the little boy goes off his grandfather's lap, and he sees this game is going nowhere. He decides to play a game, so he runs outside, and he goes to the door, and he calls out, Zayda, Zayda, grandfather, grandfather. And the grandfather says, yes, that is Zayda. Which means we have to start to appreciate who we really are. When I think of myself, what am I thinking of? Am I thinking of my head, my eyes, my body, the reality around me, the relationships I have with other people? Who am I? What is my identity? So let's read text number 2 on page 5. What we're going to do to be able to understand and appreciate who we are, we turn to Kabbalah. Teachings of Kabbalah. This is a teaching of Reb Chaim Vital, who was one of the students of the Holy Arizal, who the Arizal lived in the city of Tzfat about 500 years ago and authored many works on Kabbalah. Many of them were written by his students, one of them Reb Chaim Vital. So this, in Shari Kedusha, this text number 2, was written by Reb Chaim Vital. And he writes, the wise are aware that the human body is not the human being. When we speak of the human being, we are referring to the human's inner dimension. The body is merely a garment in which the soul is attired during its sojourn in the world. So the first thing, and many of us have probably heard this before, is to recognize that the body is not who we are. And I think that's something that we understand. There's more to it. So in order to appreciate it, let's jump a few slides. Okay, so this we're going to watch is a little video meditation that they put into the courses that talks about and gives us a little perspective, appreciation of what's deeper than the body and who we truly are before we discuss it together. I'm assuming you can hear the sound.
Hi, this is Rabbi Shestab. Welcome to a series of meditations for the course Journey of the Soul. The purpose of these meditations is going to be internalizing some of the deeper ideas that are a little bit difficult to grasp. And generally, we will try to do so by way of visualization, trying to picture symbols that represent some of the ideas and that we can focus on briefly so that we can begin to connect on a deeper level to these ideas. To begin with, the entire notion of life is a challenging concept because it is so intangible. We're used to relating to things, to that which we can see, to that which we can touch. And life is completely intangible. How do we begin to relate to that which is unseeable, untouchable? How do we envision, how do we see the unseeable? So if you will, I'll ask you to begin right now, however you're most comfortable doing so. Close your eyes, keep your eyes open. Envision a musical instrument, a physical object, let's say a piano, made of wood and wires, something you can look at with your physical eyes, you can touch it with your physical hands. It's a physical object. Now, the piano is merely a thing. A person comes over to the piano, the pianist sits down and begins playing a beautiful song. Now, this song stirs your soul. Try to hear it. Hear the music. Where is the song? Can you see it? Can you touch it? You can see and touch the piano. You can't see or touch the song. And now the song is over and the piano is standing there. If you'll open up the piano, will you find the song? Think now how everything in the world is matter and energy. The matter is the physical object that we see, the piano. The energy is the intangible, the song. We'll take a half a minute now to try to think of ourselves in these terms. Think of your body as the instrument, the physical object that can be seen, that can be touched. And think of the life you live as the song that is being played through the instrument. We'll take half a minute right now to see and hear the piano and the song, the body and the soul.
So it's given us a little perspective that we could appreciate, start to appreciate that who I am is not the physical body that I have, but it's something a little deeper. It's my soul. It's not my knowledge, it's not my intellect, it's not my emotions or desires. It's something a little deeper. The true me is my soul. Okay? So that's the first thing that we want to put into place, to establish. But there are a lot of things in life that we pretend to understand. To name a few, relativity, electricity, right? Yeah, if someone asks you, do you understand electricity? Yeah, I got it, I understand it. But do we really understand it? Not really. I mean, we can make sense of it. In the same way, yes, we could make sense, and we could say, okay, I understand that there is a concept of a soul, and there's something deeper, and I'm really not my body. I'm something more than my intellect, than my knowledge, than my emotions, than my desires. But the question is, what am I? How do we understand that soul? What is that soul? Because I understand that if I understand that I'm not the body, that just allows me to realize that I'm not what I thought I might be. I'm something deeper. But what is that thing that's deeper? What is that soul? And that's what we want to establish first and foremost. Who is the real me? What is that soul? So we go to text number 3a, and we go to the Torah, the very beginning of creation. We're going to contrast the text that is written with regards to the creation of man, and contrast that with the text that's written in the Torah regarding the creation of animals. So when it talks about the creation of man, the Torah says in Genesis, God formed the human of soil from the earth and breathed into his nostrils the neshama, the soul of life. Let's look at what it says about animals. About animals, it says, God said, let the earth bring forth living beings of different species, cattle, creeping things, and beasts of the earth, according to their species, and it was so. Now let's look at these two, and what do we see is different between them? Any suggestions? I'll open up the chat box. Let's look at the text and let's try to see what is the difference between, what striking differences are there between the way the human was created and animals. If you don't mind, please share in the chat box. Anyone see a difference? Oh, okay. So I have a suggestion here that, which is very true. Humans have a divine soul that was breathed into them. Animals only have an animal soul. God gave the soul to humans. Okay, so it's obvious that animals have some kind of soul because they're living beings, and so they were created with a soul. The difference, however, is that when the animals were created, they were created together with their soul. Which means when life began for the animal, when life begins for the animal, that's the very beginning of its life. It never existed before. The life never existed before. Okay, which means, again, the animal is created, and when it's created, when an animal is born, it's created together with its life. That is the moment it's born is the very beginning of that animal's life. When it dies, that's the end of its body and its life. Its life goes back. Its life goes back to its source, to wherever it came from. That's the end. When it comes to a human being, first came the hardware, then came the software. First, God created the physical element, the human being, from soil, from the earth. Only afterwards did God breathe into him into his nostril the neshama, the soul of life, which teaches us something very important. That the soul and the body do not share their existence. They're two separate entities. You have a body and you have a soul. Animals don't have that. The body and the soul of the animal is one and the same. Their life and their body it's all the same. With a human being, however, our life is independent. Our soul is independent of our body. And this is very important because when we think about when life begins, we now have to focus a little bit more on our soul, because that's the true me. When did that life begin? And when does that life end? Text number 3C, it's page 7 in the textbook, the PDF. God did what he had not done with any other creature. He blew into Adam with his Holy Spirit and neshama that is immortal and does not perish when the body does. So it's independent from the body. The soul does not need the body. The soul is eternal. These are some of the differences. The body lives only for a certain amount of years. The soul, however, is eternal. And the body and the soul are separate, are not dependent on one another. So when we talk about life, a person is born, we talk about a person being born and a person dying. That is only the beginning and the end of life for the body, but not for the soul, which is the true me. We haven't really truly gotten to the essence of what the soul is. But what we know is right now is that the soul is something deeper, independent of the body. So the body was formed from the earth, the soul is inserted into the body, and for the animal, the life force and body are together. The soul, which is very important to know, to pay attention to this, that the soul does not perish when the body does. Okay. So what's the real me? The real me is my soul, not my body. The real me, the soul, is eternal. Just like the soul is eternal, so am I eternal. And the real eternal me is unaffected by birth or death, because we said that God blew that soul into the body, which means that soul existed before the body existed. So when the body ceases to exist or to live, that doesn't affect the soul, because the soul is living independent of the body. Now we can understand that death isn't really an end. We look at death as an end of a life. And in reality, if the soul is the real me, then death isn't the end, it's just the beginning of a new phase. I want to take a moment to look at text number 4. We're going to read text number 4 and text number 5. I'm going to read them, but we take a moment to pay attention to these texts. And after I read both of the texts, I'd like to ask you to share some thoughts on these texts. So this first one, text number 4, is from the Midrash. And the Midrash says the follows. Text number 4 on page 8. 40 days before the conception of a child, God summons the angel in charge of souls and tells him, Bring before me a certain soul that is now in paradise. Its name is such and such, and its appearance is such and such. This is possible because all the souls that are born in this world were created on the day the world was created and exist until the end of time. The angel goes and brings the soul before God. The soul bows and prostrates itself before the Supreme King of Kings. God instructs the soul, please enter the seminal drop that is currently in the hands of the angel in charge of pregnancy. The soul protests, Master of the universe, I am quite satisfied with the world I inhabit since the day you created me. I am holy and pure, hewn from the throne of glory. Why do you wish to cause me to enter this putra drop? So there's a fear. It's interesting because when you start to read this, there's a fear. We think of fear of death. There's actually a fear of birth from the soul's perspective. Text number 5. This world is like a corridor before the world to come. Prepare yourself in the corridor so that you may enter the palace. A single moment of bliss in the world to come is greater than all of this world. Any comments, thoughts on these texts, questions? There's more than just this world, than the soul coming down into this body, into this world. And that the soul existed before. The soul is now put into this world. And what we read it here is, interestingly, that the way we look at this world as opposed to the world to come. One is the corridor, and the world to come is, so to speak, the palace. So if you're looking at this world versus the next world, it would almost seem that this world is less significant compared to the palace. This is only the corridor. But at this point, what I want to bring out is that we should understand that the real me is put into this world. This world is now only a corridor. And this real me existed before, and it will continue to exist after this world's, after the body completes its mission in this world and goes on to the palace. The soul continues to live. So again, the point here is to recognize that the soul is something much greater than the body, and the soul began earlier, before the person was born, before the child was born, and the soul continues to live even after life is over for the body. So this really concludes step 1 of the class, which is, what is the neshama? Who is the real me? The real me is my soul. What is the soul? The soul is a breath from God, a higher reality, a greater reality, which lives independent and beyond the experience of the body. Which would seem to imply that this world isn't that relevant. Because the soul is the most important thing. The real me is my soul. The real me existed before this world was created, and the real me will continue afterwards. Now, if that's the real me, yeah, I'm going to have less anxiety about death, because I understand that the real me actually lives forever and isn't affected by death. So I could calm down. But it creates a very important question, which we're going to try to create harmony with. And the question is, we know that there is no greater mitzvah than saving a life. Saving a life, and we all know that during this corona pandemic, it's something that we've all become very aware of, doing whatever we can to save a life, which is ultimately the greatest thing that we could do. Nearly greater than any other mitzvah. Let's look at text number 6 on page 12. It says, if a non-Jew, hold on one second. Attempts to force a Jew to violate one of the Torah's commandments at the pain of death, which was quite common in days of old. Thank God, not so much today. The Jew should violate the commandment rather than be killed, because the Torah states concerning the mitzvot, a person shall do them and live by them. Leviticus 18, verse 5. One should live by them and not die because of them. And life is so important, which means life in this world, and this is the point. Life in the body is so valued in Jewish thought that even when a person seems to be at that moment before death, we try everything possible to extend that person's life. Now, of course, there are certain situations where that person might be, where we don't want to cause a person pain, and so we might opt in certain situations not to do anything. But under circumstances where we have the ability, even though we know that a person is moments before death, we will do whatever possible to extend that person's life even one extra moment, because we value life in this world. We know one of the greatest things is pikuach nefesh, life, sanctity of life, dochet HaShabbat, which pushes off the Shabbat. If a person is Shabbat, we're very careful not to do certain forms of work. And when it comes, nevertheless, when it comes to a person's life, because of the sanctity of the physical life, we push off the Shabbat. It reminds me of a little cute story when my oldest daughter, Mushka, was perhaps somewhere between 1 and 2 years old. It was a Friday night, and we had gone to a nearby a neighbor, someone who lived a couple streets away from us, on a Friday night to celebrate Shabbat. And we walked back home. She must have been about 2 years old. And we came back to our apartment. We found out that we had left the key inside. So what were we going to do? So we went to the gas station. And when we went into the gas station, which was right behind our apartment, there was a guy in the convenience store who, we asked him, he was there talking with a friend, and we asked him if he would do us a favor. Devorah had memorized the landlord's phone number, or it was on the key, on the keychain. There was the landlord or the maintenance guy, whatever the phone number. So she gave the phone number to this guy, and the guy is so confused. Like, why are you asking me to call this guy? You can take the phone, just do it yourself. We're trying to explain. We can't tell him to do it. We're trying to, like, you're not allowed to ask someone to do work on Shabbos for you. So you have to, like, sort of hint it. And the guy wasn't getting it. So we couldn't say, can you make this phone call? We're trying to explain that it's Shabbos and we can't really make this phone call. We know the phone number. Like, hoping that he would get the message and try to and pick up the phone and make the phone call for us. But he wasn't getting the message. So his friend that was standing there says, I got it. I know exactly what to do. So he picks up the phone and he calls the superintendent, whatever they call him, and they say, and he tells him, he gets through, and he says, there's one of your tenants is locked out of the apartment, and is there any way that you could, whatever, gets the guy to come. He puts down the phone, and he looks at us, and he says, in a heavy Israeli accent, Pikuach nefesh dochet Shabbat. Sanctity of life terminates the Shabbat. And at that point, I gasped. I remember, oh my God, the guy is Jewish. That's why he knew what to do. But there was no pikuach nefesh. There was no danger involved. He said, you had a little kid, and that was his excuse. But we could have gotten around it. We could have figured it out. We would have been in our beds that night anyway, with some creativity. But it was cute. It was a funny moment. But the fact is that sanctity of life is so important, which means that we value this world, which seems to imply that there is in our focus here in this world, there's something beyond the soul, because the soul is that thing that lives up there, right, and comes down and lives within the body, but is independent of the body. Yet when we talk about mitzvot and our work in this world, we're sort of saying, no, this world is more important. Your body is more important, because if you have a choice between living and dying, guess what? You got to live, which sort of makes it reinforces the idea that the body is of greater significance, because if you have a choice between living and dying isn't really dying, because dying is your soul just living on in a different form. Yet we say that the most important thing is to actually live in this world. Text number 7, page 13. And this is actually the conclusion of text number 4, which was the Medrash talking about how the soul does not want to come into this world. So when the soul does not want to come into this world, God hurries to reassure the descending soul, the world to which I am bringing you will prove more beneficial than the one you presently inhabit. Indeed, I formed you exclusively for the purpose of creating mortal life from this particular drop of seed. With that, God forcibly installs the soul. Okay, so this soul ends up in this world. But what we're saying here is that what is our focus? The soul's focus is life in this world, in the physical body. I wanted to share something that wasn't part of the curriculum, a video that I share with, whenever I give a lesson to bar bat mitzvah, a student for bar and bat mitzvah, and I want to talk to them about the meaning of a bar mitzvah, because the meaning of a bar mitzvah is ultimately where the soul is coming into the body fully. When the soul is born, God blows and gives a little bit. When the body is born, person's born, the soul comes in stages, and the final stage is at the bar and bat mitzvah. So I always teach them this idea, this concept, that the soul doesn't really want to come down into this world. The soul is sort of forced into this world. But I always like to give them a visual, and I thought it would be fun or interesting just to see the visual that I give them. So I'm going to give that visual to you as well, a little video, and just instead of seeing it as a person, see it as a soul, and that's the way I envision this encounter between God and the soul. So let's just, here we go.
2, 3, go! Don't look down. Don't look down. Look up. Now you're still looking down. Keep on looking down. You see the yellow ball in front of you? Keep on looking at it.
I shortened it from the one I showed to the kids.
Looking up. He's going looking up and he's still looking down there. This time, gonna wait. You're not gonna wait. Okay. I'm gonna count. 3, 2, 1. Off you go. No problem. Lean forward. Nice deep breath. Here we go. 3,
Okay.
2, 1. Boom, baby.
Ultimately, he was pushed down there.
Yeah, man. Tall guy. 1, 2.
Okay? And that's what happens to the soul. The soul does not want to go down. It knows it's important. It knows it needs to, and it stands there, but the soul does not want to go down until it's pushed down. In fact, we're going to take it even a step further. Not only is it so important that the soul is pushed into this world to fulfill a mission, but we're going to see let's just continue in text number 8 on page 13. A single moment of repentance and of good deeds in this world is greater than all of the world to come. So, while the real me, perhaps, is my soul, and that calms me down when I think about death, because ultimately I'm not really dying, my soul continues to live, because that's the real me. Yet, the life that the soul lives in the body in this world is actually greater than all of the world to come. The experience in this world is greater than the world to come. So the soul is on a journey here. It starts off in a place of light, of great light, of the godly light, spirituality, a place that it really feels comfortable. But it's told that in order to really appreciate the godly light, you have to go down into this world and experience something. And that experience is actually going to be more impactful, greater than any experience that you're going to have in the spiritual worlds. Okay, so I noticed that there are a few questions. I don't know if I can get to all of them, but what happens to a soul if a person leaves Judaism? It's a very good question. I think we'll answer it tonight. Okay. Ultimately, we never really leave Judaism, but we'll get to it. And if I don't, we can bring it up again. What happens to someone who converts to Judaism? They get a soul at the time of conversion, which means just like the soul of the first human being was first created as a body, and then the soul came into it, they go through that experience as well. That experience is actually one of the reasons why a convert has to go into a mikvah, a ritual bath. The ritual bath is almost like the water that a baby's in, and then the water breaks and the child is born. That is an experience of a rebirth. In fact, in Judaism, and I'll get to you in a moment. In fact, in Judaism, we believe that we consider the day that a person converts and goes into the ritual bath as their birthday. So we'll still observe their regular birthday, and we won't say they're 1 year old now or 2 years old, but there's a rebirth. And the Hebrew birthday, for myself, for example, the Hebrew birthday is the Hebrew date that was on July 14th, 1976, which would be the 16th of Tammuz. So every year, 16th of Tammuz is my birthday. But for someone who converted, there was actually someone we know, we went through conversion. Tonight would be her Jewish birthday, even though it has nothing to do, no relationship with her secular date, her date of birth. Because the Hebrew date, which she went to the mikvah, to the ritual bath, was on the 22nd. I'm going to answer these questions just very quickly. Okay, so I think we went through some of these questions. I'm not going to read every comment, although I've read them. I closed the chat box. Ira, I know, has a hard time with the chat box, so I'm going to allow you to unmute yourself.
Rabbi, I'm not sure if you said this or I understand it. Only Jewish people have a soul?
I didn't say that at all.
No, but you said a soul. So does every human being have a soul?
Yeah, yes, but there is something as a Jewish soul. It's actually a very good point that you're making here. There is a distinction between a regular soul and a Jewish soul. It is not the time tonight to discuss what that difference is, but that is something that we can discuss, and it's something that I'm very comfortable, topic that I'm very comfortable with. Which again we could discuss. The nature of the soul of a Jew and the nature of a general soul is slightly different. It all has to do with mission and purpose in this world, and each individual, each human being is given a different purpose and mission in this world, and based on our mission we're given a different soul, and we're born to Jewish people so that we know what our mission is. Okay, so that allows us to be able to focus, because if in one family we could have one person born with a Jewish soul and the other person born with a non-Jewish soul, you would never know who had what and what their mission is. What that mission is, we have to discuss, and that again, this is beyond the scope of our lesson. So this idea, when we talk about, and it's good that you brought that up, because it was perhaps unclear based on the question that was asked that I answered. But for tonight's purpose, we're talking generally about the human soul. Okay, more specifically, we're talking about the Jewish soul, because this class is primarily for Jewish people. I think everybody here tonight, as far as I know, is Jewish. Sometimes we do have people who aren't, and we welcome them. But we're focusing on the Jewish soul. But it's irrelevant. The same idea would relate to them as well. Okay, to get back onto to our lesson. Not only is the being in this world greater than the experience that the soul has, or the actions of this world, more significant than the experience that the soul has, even though it might feel or might be more pleasurable, right? The pleasure, we have to distinguish between the pleasure and the importance. The pleasure that the soul has is much greater in the world to come, much greater. It's really experiencing what it loves best, which is spirituality. And in this world, it can't really get that. And that's what it's yearning for. It's yearning for spirituality because its nature is spiritual. Okay? So it's a difficult journey for the soul to be in a physical body that has to focus a lot on food, and which we'll talk a little bit how we could change that perception, but it's focused on material needs more than spiritual needs. So the pleasure is much greater in the spiritual world. In actuality, what one can accomplish in this world is much more than they can accomplish in the other worlds. In fact, the entire spiritual world, everything we know in the spiritual world, is actually created for the benefit of this world, which means we spoke about, I addressed one of Ira's questions earlier, thinking about we were talking about angels and the spiritual worlds, right? God created spiritual worlds and God created the physical world. So God created the spiritual worlds because he wanted to be able to create the physical world, which means the spiritual worlds, the purpose of the spiritual worlds and all the function of the spiritual worlds is in order to ultimately create the physical world. I'm not going to get into the reason why God did that, because that's another subject on its own. But the point that I'm making now is to recognize that this physical world is of utmost importance to God and to the whole creation of spirituality and physicality. Text number 9. God created the universe on a condition. If the Jews accept the Torah, he told the universe, you will continue to exist. If they do not, I will return you to nothingness, which means that what this Talmud is teaching us is that there's a purpose in creation. God didn't just create the world so that, there could be a world and we could do whatever we want. There's a purpose. And everything that was created around it is for that purpose. So if we fulfill that purpose, which is making this world meaningful through our spiritual endeavors, Torah and mitzvot, and we'll talk about that, then we fulfilled the purpose, and then there was a reason to create everything else, whether it's the spiritual aspects or the physical, material world. Let's use an example of a wedding. Okay, talk about a wedding. So, bride and groom make up, they're going to get married, and they prepare all of the things that they need in order to get married. What is that? They need a wedding hall, they need a caterer, they need a florist, and they need a photographer. Everything else is a bonus. So they have all the things that they need. A day before the wedding, or a few days before the wedding, when everything's arranged, either the bride or the groom decides to break off. So a week before, if you told me how important the florist was, every flower was so important. And if I got one flower wrong on one bouquet, on one table, if that centerpiece was off a little bit, that would be, it would create anxiety and excitement, and everybody's going crazy for this little flower. You couldn't get that one flower that I wanted, and it was so important. If I'm not going to have my photographer and everything was of utmost importance. However, the moment there's no bride or there's no groom, because one decides they're not going ahead with it, then the flowers, everything that I thought a week ago was so important to my life, is so unimportant. Why? Simply because it wasn't the florist. The florist and the photographer and the caterer and the hall were only important to be able to create the marriage. But if there's no relationship between the bride and the groom, then everything else is unimportant. Yeah. So God created this world. The purpose of everything was in order to allow the soul to come down into this world and to accomplish something, to fulfill their life of doing goodness and studying Torah, fulfilling mitzvot, and creating holiness in this physical world. The moment that we're not doing what we're supposed to do, meaning if no one was doing what they were supposed to do, then there's no purpose not only of this physical world, there's no purpose for any of the spiritual world either, because the physical and spiritual worlds are all here for one reason, and that is to allow us to fulfill and to accomplish what we need to accomplish. So again, the point that we're making over here is, we spoke about the soul. That's step number one, to recognize that the real me is the neshama, is the soul. The breath that God breathed into Adam and breathed into every one of us when we are born. A soul that existed before we were born and will exist even after our body dies. The second point is to recognize the value of this world, which is the difference, and to recognize that for the soul, there's a difference of pleasure. That's when it was in this world, or after it's in this world, and the importance of this world. So the pleasure is the soul, the pleasure the soul has from the spiritual worlds, again, before it's born and after it moves on, after the body dies. The importance is in this world itself. And that's why it says in text number 10 on page 15, against your will you are formed, and against your will you are born. Against your will you live, and against your will you die. What does that mean? Because to come down into this world, it's only because God wanted that soul to come into this world. So it's against our will. It's against our will to die because ultimately the importance is this world. So when we're in this world, we have to value every minute in this world. So it's against our will that we die because we don't want to die. Because we recognize when we're here in this world, we recognize the importance of this world. So again, it's pleasure versus importance. So against, going to the slide, against your will, just have to, hold on. Against your will you were born. Against your will you will die. Hold on. Okay. The next world ultimately is much more pleasurable for the soul. Doesn't look anything like that. It's a very mundane physical pleasure. Okay. I would have put music or something. You know, more of a spiritual experience. Okay, but the next world is more pleasurable. But this world is much more important. So when we're talking about dealing with the anxiety of death, the reason why we want to live longer is not because we have an anxiety of death. We're not really concerned about, well, of course we are. It's natural to. And we're going to continue that way. Okay? Some of us more, some of us less. But I think this can help us to realize, to understand the Jewish perspective, is that because I recognize that my true self is my soul and that will live forever, I don't really have that much anxiety as a result, because I'm not really going to die. It's just the body is going to lay down and rest, and the real me is going to continue. I will live on. So I don't have that anxiety. But at the same time, I don't want to die either, because I recognize how important this world is. Text number 11 is a diary by the previous Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak Schneerson, who came to the United States in 1940 and was put in jail and actually had a death sentence, which was eventually overturned, for counter-revolutionary activity in the former Soviet Union, which is basically, he was considered a troublemaker by the troublemakers, okay? So he writes as follows: I arrived for interrogation at the office of the Soviet GPU. However, in keeping with my principles, I was not cooperative. One of the interrogators raised the revolver that sat on the desk before him. He looked me in the eye and mockingly said, "This small toy has incredible powers. It causes principles to melt away. It opens mouths. Under its spell, even mutes have become talkative." I responded, "You are quite mistaken. That toy only has an effect on faint-hearted non-believers, those with one world and multiple gods. We, on the other hand, have one God and two worlds. As such, I don't panic at the sight of your toy. It has no effect on me whatsoever." Now, of course, the previous Rebbe wanted to remain in this world. He recognized the importance of this world and of every deed and action in this world, and that the whole creation was made for this world. So he wanted to live. However, he also realized that if he couldn't continue to act upon the important things in this world, and someone was going to take his life, it didn't create anxiety, because yes, I want to live in this world, but this is not the only life that I have. I have a life beyond that, and I'll just continue that way. Which also gives us a little perspective, and I think that you'll find this interesting, a little perspective on the difference between Judaism and other religions in respect to their relationship with this world. A lot of religions, there is actually a forget where I had it, where someone lived at a time where he lived together with Muslims, and he saw in Islam their focus. One of the things that they didn't like was when people mourned death. Well, we know that's a problem because of it, right? If someone mourns death, they didn't appreciate it. And the reason why they didn't appreciate it was because to them, life in the next world was the most important thing. This world is irrelevant. So here we've established that in Judaism, while we believe that there is a much more, a world that is much more enjoyable, perhaps, this world is actually the most important. And therefore, while we don't have anxiety, perhaps, in Judaism about dying because there is life after this world, we still mourn death because of the importance of this world. So again, we see the value of life after death, and we see that there's something deeper than our body and our physical reality, but we also recognize the importance of the physical reality and the importance of this physical world and acting with it. There's a story that I read many, many years ago that I really love. It was about a chassid who spent his days and nights studying. He was an elderly chassid, spent his elderly years, his retirement years, studying Torah and praying. And because he studied and prayed so much, he never really got to his bed. And he would sleep in the synagogue on a bench. Right before he passed away, he was dying, and he said to his friends, he said, I regret all the years that I slept on the bench rather than on a bed. Why? You've been studying Torah all these years. He said, because if I would have slept in a bed, perhaps I would have been a little healthier, and I could have extended my life even one more day. And I would have been able to put on tefillin for one more day, one more time. What he realized was, they said it was only someone who slept on a bench could ultimately come to that realization, which means he lived a life that he was able to appreciate this physical world. But the point of the story is that he was able to value every day of living, which means the entire way I did everything was, I realize now that perhaps it was wrong because I could have had one more day, because ultimately the most important thing for the soul is to be in this world. This world is the most important thing. So again, we're not afraid of death. As we see here, text number 12, there's a quote from a Talmud of one of the sages, Rabbi Yehuda the Prince. He fell ill, this is page 17, and lay on his deathbed. Rabbi Chia, another sage, entered and found him weeping. My master, exclaimed Rabbi Chia, why do you weep? Was it not taught, if one dies smiling, it is a good sign for him, while weeping, it is a bad sign for him? And Rabbi Yehuda replied, I weep because of my inability to study the Torah and observe the commandments after death. Similar story to the one I shared with you. But the idea is that we recognize that we have a mission here on this world. And leaving this world means that I'm leaving this mission. So we have concluded step 1 and step 2 of this class. And in the last 5 minutes, I just want to share some related things that I think you'll find very interesting. And I think, and this part actually will answer one of the questions that we asked before. What happens to someone who perhaps doesn't live Jewishly or converts to out of Judaism? What happens to them? So again, it's not going to answer this directly, but it'll give us a little perspective. And it says, and I'm going to try to be short. I know it's 9 o'clock already, but maybe 5 minutes or so, and I'll try to finish this. It says in the Talmud, text 13, that after their demise, tzaddikim, righteous people, are referred to as being alive, which means that when we talk about the righteous, after they die, they are still referred to as being alive. Now, based on what we've learned, that the real me is the soul. If the real me is my soul, then why would I be any different than a righteous person? If they live after 120, after the body is the life of the body is over, and we say they are still alive, why wouldn't that apply to me? Just because I'm not a righteous person? I also have a soul, and the soul continues to live. So how do we understand that? And the answer is that it's the negative behaviors that die with the body. All of us, the spiritual endeavors, the things that we do that are purposeful in our lives, the Torah that we study, the mitzvot that we fulfill, whether they're mitzvot between us and God or mitzvot between us and mankind, those purposeful and meaningful things are things that the soul relates to. That's the important thing that the soul comes into this world for. So that continues to live forever. So, people like myself, simple people, we go through life, we do our best. We try to study some Torah, we try to do mitzvot, but we are still physical, materialistic people, and we have our physical pleasures, material pleasures that we also have. So our life, the way it is in this world, perhaps doesn't completely continue after we leave this world, for the very simple reason, because our life, a lot of our life, a big part of our life, is materialistic things that the soul doesn't relate to after 120. And so that part of life is over. The righteous, however, their lives, the righteous that we're referring to, are people whose entire lives are focused on their mission, on purpose and meaning, on studying Torah and fulfilling mitzvot. Those righteous, which we learn, which are very few in this world, there aren't a lot of them, those righteous people, they live forever, they continue to live because their entire life continues to live. With us, it's only a part of our life that continues to live. Yes, it's our essence, it's the real soul. But the function in this world, it's only a part of that function, and the things that were important to us in this world that continue to live on after 120. Most of what we do, the physical, material aspects of our lives, I always tell people, I often tell people after they pass away that, especially at the unveiling, which is a time to reflect on a person's life, that we could continue to live with that person. But that person's interests are very different than they were until now. Until now, the person might have liked traveling, surfing, eating, going to a good restaurant, dancing, and so on. But now the focus of that person's life is very, very different. So the way we relate to that person is also different. But ultimately, this concept that relates entirely to the righteous also relates to us as well, from the perspective of our soul and from the perspective of those actions that we do which are purposeful. So how does that ultimately relate to our lives? The idea is like this. I want to just read one verse, the chapter, the last text 15. And text 15 says as follows: Behold, I have set before you today life and goodness and death and evil. Choose life. Why does God say to choose life? God tells us to choose life. I mean, who wouldn't choose life? The term life in this verse does not refer to corporeal life, nor does death refer to the result of the soul's departure, for which simpleton needs to be instructed to choose life. Rather, each creation, while alive and fully existent, contains both life and death. The physicality of the object is intrinsically lifeless. It is in a constant state of decline and deterioration. We observe this decline in every physical object as well as in ourselves. Our physical capabilities and powers weaken with time. By contrast, the spiritual and divine within each thing is alive, eternal, and not subject to destruction or deterioration, God forbid. And so, we talk about the corridor, and we spoke about the palace. And the truth is, while we say that life here is a corridor and the palace is the world to come, we can actually, if we focus on this world, we could recognize that actually this world could be the palace. Meaning that the physical body, our physical existence in this world, is only for a purpose to get to something greater beyond itself. And that is the palace that we're trying to reach. And how do we do that? So it's not about all or nothing. It's not about dedicating my life to only spirituality. The idea is to become more focused on spirituality, to become more soul-oriented, which means, in very practical terms, we're very physical people. So I like a good cup of coffee. So I'm going to enjoy my cup of coffee. Now, some righteous tzaddik, he has his coffee just because he's cold, he needs to have a hot drink and doesn't enjoy the coffee at all, perhaps. But I'm going to enjoy my coffee. But what's the purpose of this coffee? I'm going to go in and enjoy a moment in the gym. And I really enjoy when I go to the gym. I enjoy when I go to the pool. And I enjoy it when I go to and see nature. But what's the purpose? So if I'm soul-oriented, and I want to focus on my soul, I do those things in order to give me more appreciation of life so that I could fulfill my mission on this life better. I work because I need to bring in an income so that I could serve God. So it's just a different perspective, a different way of seeing life in general. That's really what this is all about. So again, life doesn't begin when I'm born, which I might have thought before I started tonight's class. And life doesn't end when my life seems to have ended at 120 years old. Sometimes that 120 years is extended longer. For some people it's shorter, but the 120, it's around that for most people. The idea is that we recognize tonight that my existence was before this world, my existence is after this world, and my true existence is my soul. And this recognition that my true existence is the soul is the premise of all the lessons that come after. Starting next week, we're going to get into a little more detail. We'll talk about the soul's departure from the body and what happens afterwards from the soul's perspective. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about the soul and what happens, and many of us are interested in what happens to the soul. However, the thing that we had to first appreciate is what is life. And life began again before we were born. Life continues after our body, after death, and that's really the premise of this course. So that is the lesson number 1. Excited to move forward into the next lesson. We will also discuss the moments of passing, burial, the preparations, grave visitation, and so on. So that will be next week. I want to thank everybody for joining.